I spoke with the chair of the Washington State Republican Party, and I'll play that interview for you in a moment. I should note that we taped it on Thursday, and so you might have some slight adjustments in where the races stand today. On Friday, there's a couple that are pretty close that we're keeping an eye on. But Caleb Heimlich was pretty honest. The fact that the Tuesday primary did not turn out as they expected. I think there had been this sort of a feeling that there was momentum on the part of Republicans because of the state of the economy, the low approval ratings of President Joe Biden. And so we talked about that and sort of what went wrong, and also how they're going to change their messaging or hone in their messaging on issues that matter most, like the issue of abortion. It became pretty clear on Tuesday that voters did prioritize that, at least in Washington State, as an issue when they filled out their ballot. So here's my conversation with Washington State Republican Party Chair Caleb Heimlich. Caleb, I appreciate you being here. There was a lot of excitement, I think, for Republicans building toward the primary. How do you think things went?
Well, I think anybody that thought it was going to be easy in Washington State was being naive. And so I think we have our work cut out for us for the next 98 days, but there are certainly some good opportunities in front of us. And in particular, I think the 42nd legislative district up in Whatcom County, that's 2 House seats that we don't currently hold, where the Republican vote share is 51% plus. So I think that's a positive sign. But there's some other legislative districts, kind of the 26th in the Senate, the 47th, that I think we were hoping to pick up, and I think we still can, but we've got work to do to kind of close the gap and make sure we're winning voters over there. The 8th congressional district is obviously going to be super competitive. Kim Schreier's below 50%. It looks like Matt Larkin's going to come through there. We'll see ultimately over the next couple of days with all the ballots getting counted. But big picture, I think, again, in Washington State, we've got our work cut out for us, and I think we're up to the challenge.
Just because you were kind of listing off races there, the U.S. Senate race, the state party had been really excited about Tiffany Smiley. You guys endorsed her early, which is very unusual. You usually let things play out in the primary first. How do you feel about her performance?
So I think as a first-time candidate, obviously she's moving on to November, so that's kind of the first hurdle to clear. Patty Murray in the low 50s. I think she's dropped from above 54 to below 54. Hoping to see that trend continue a little bit. Lines up to be a relatively competitive race. I think we've always known it's going to be tough. The fact that Senator Murray and her campaign spent $4 or $5 million really going after Tiffany in June, I think impacted some of this primary results. We're now seeing the NRSC, the Senatorial Committee, is running an ad talking about Patty Murray's support for President Biden. And I think President Biden remains unpopular in Washington State. So I think that's going to help move some numbers. And I think the more that Tiffany tells her story, gets her message out there, that will help compete with the swing voters that we really need to kind of move over and make that race even more competitive. So obviously not the best results, but I do think there's still a path there.
And the 4th congressional district and the 3rd congressional district, it was sort of a national focus. We had 2 Republican incumbents with pro-Trump challengers. It seems like the incumbents are going to be able to move forward to the general election. Do you think that's the best outcome for the party?
Well, I think first and foremost, we've got to count all the votes to see what happens. I think there's a lot of votes to count in the 3rd. And so with the drops, it'll be interesting to see if anything changes there. Ultimately, our position at the state has been, since the committee didn't endorse, we didn't get involved in those races, we're focused on holding those seats in November. And I think we're in a strong position to do that in both the 3rd and the 4th.
So the state party didn't and doesn't have a preference as to whether the incumbents move forward or their pro-Trump challengers move forward.
Yeah, we did not take any action in those 2 races.
Either way, that dynamic exists in those districts, and regardless of when the votes are official, whether the incumbents or the pro-Trump challengers move forward, you have a clear rift there. In those districts, in those parties. How do you repair that to give those candidates a chance in the general election?
I think at the end of the day, Republican voters are looking at the future of our country, looking at what's at stake. I think Republican voters all agree we don't want Speaker Pelosi. We want some balance back in Washington, D.C. We want to check on President Biden's agenda. And the House is within reach. We need 4 seats to flip the House. And I think that is the most likely scenario. Most national observers are saying that the Senate is a more difficult path. So the House is kind of Republicans' best hope of providing some balance in Washington, D.C. And I think the last thing we want is to lose 2 seats or either of those seats to someone whose first vote would be for Speaker Pelosi, referring to the Democrat candidates. So I think that is the message to Republican voters, regardless of who gets through, and a part of the kind of the motivation to hold the party together in the 3rd and the 4th district.
So just generally speaking, a lot of polls leading up to this primary about what issues would drive voters. I was of the belief that inflation would be at the top of the list in the economy, just because the everyday impact. Do you think Republicans and the Republican Party underestimated how much abortion would factor in Washington state?
Well, I think for any analysis, it's important to keep in mind at this point, we're looking at 25% turnout. So 25% of the voters have chosen to participate in the middle of summer. It is only a month and a half, 2 months after the Dobbs decision. So this electorate will be a different electorate in 96 days and the November election. So it obviously we need to do more analysis. We'll be doing some exit polling. We'll be talking to voters and understanding what's driving them. As we've knocked on doors, over 200,000 doors in the different targeted legislative districts, overwhelmingly what we're hearing from swing voters is inflation and public safety concerns as the top 2 voters. I do think, particularly for Democratic voters, abortion has been a big motivator and may have caused their turnout to be higher than it otherwise would have been. So that certainly could be factoring into the results and what we're seeing in August. But if Democrats got voters who were going to vote in November anyway, if those voters voted in August because they were extra amped because of the Dobbs decision, that ultimately won't tip the scales much in November if they were going to vote anyway, if that makes any sense. So a lot of what we have to determine by talking to voters, by listening to them, by understanding what's motivating them, what's driving them, is kind of who turned out in August and then who's going to turn out in November. I think in November, we're expecting 70 to 75% turnout. So that's 3 times as many people as we've heard from so far in the August primary.
Well, I mean, if Democrats are motivated, Republicans need to be extra motivated in a state like Washington. I look at Kim Schreier, the congresswoman from the 8th, the Democrat. She did better in this primary, about the same, but better in this primary percentage-wise than she did in 2020. And by most accounts, 2022 should have been a much easier, a much harder primary for her with an unpopular president, midterm, and just the state of the economy, and the district was supposed to be better as well after redistricting. So how do you account for that?
Well, I think one of the biggest factors is she spent a significant sum of money in 2022, and she did not spend any money at all in the 2020 primary. So, I mean, the fact that she was up running an ad claiming to be standing up to the Biden administration or taking on, I forget the exact phrase, taking on the Biden administration, shows that she was taking this race seriously. And so I think as we're going to see a significant campaign over the next 96 days to talk about her actual voting record, what she has done, what she said herself when it comes to knowing that the votes were going to contribute to inflation, as she said on a town hall, and she's on record saying, I understand this is going to help contribute to inflation, and voting for it anyway. And pictures of her walking hand in hand with President Biden in Seward Park in Seattle. So I think there's still a lot of campaigning to be done and messaging to voters on what her record has been in 4 years as a member of Congress and what our candidate would do going forward. So I'm not not fatalistic about those results in the least. I think given the fact that she spent a lot of money, was up on TV, was campaigning pretty aggressively in the mail, and is still below 50%, shows that there's a path to electing a Republican in the 8th.
Yeah, you want to be above 50% as an incumbent, certainly. But, the conventional wisdom was that either Reagan Dunn or Jesse Jensen would emerge to the general election. Matt Larkin is certainly, if that's how it ends up at the end of the day, he was sort of the sleeper scenario. Reagan Dunn and Jesse Jensen, I mean, they got into the mud in the final weeks. They had some pretty nasty attacks against each other. Do you think that that contributed to Matt Larkin possibly winning?
I do. I think as I talk to a lot of voters, even Republican primary voters, they're turned off by the negativity. And so, I mean, in my chronology of things, it appeared that super PACs backing Jesse went after Reagan first, and Reagan responded. And so I think ultimately, as voters saw that, were getting bombarded with that, whether it was on email, whether it was text messages, whether it was in their mailbox, whether it was on TV or digital ads, they were looking for who's the candidate that's going to make the case on what they're going to do. And Matt Larkin did a good job the last 3 weeks of making that pitch, of giving that campaign. I'm a voter in the 8th. I think I received 4 or 5 mail pieces from Matt Larkin talking about his record as a businessman, as a job creator, talking about his pitch that he's going to make crime illegal again. And so I think that his campaign worked. And I think he built a lot of momentum, really picked up steam in those last 3 weeks as voters were looking to say, who do I want to vote for? And they ultimately, if the trend holds, decided to vote for him because he gave them that reason.
Quickly on Jesse Jensen, Reagan Dunn in the mud, did you, as the state party chair, reach out to their campaigns and tell them to stop it?
I did talk with them. Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's as you know, some of this was outside their control with independent expenditures and rules about coordination and everything else. But yeah, I mean, I was on the phone with all of them talking about them. You and I have been talking about this for 4 or 5 years about civility in politics, and I think that's. I think this is going to be a case study of saying, hey, there's a benefit to making a pitch the right way.
On that note, I know we're kind of running short on time. Making a pitch the right way. If it's Matt Larkin who goes through, he's more conservative. He is certainly more conservative on the issue of abortion. What do you think is the best way to talk to voters about abortion without being dishonest, but the best messaging strategy for Republicans on abortion leading up to November?
Well, particularly at the state level, I mean, I think I would draw a dichotomy between the state and the federal, but I think at the state level, the focus is Republicans have always respected the will of the voters, and Democrats, frankly, in this state have not. You can talk about $30 car tabs, the initiative. You can talk about the carbon tax when voters voted it down, and then the very next session, Democrats implemented a very similar version of that. And so Republicans have always maintained we respect the voters and we respect what they wish. And so right now in Washington state, we've had 2 citizen initiatives codifying when abortion will be legal and when it's not. And so for our candidates for the state legislature, I think that has got to be part of the conversation of, if I'm elected, here's what I will do and here's what I won't do. At the federal level, I think you can make the case that as a constitutional conservative, which I think Matt Larkin is, obviously you'd have to ask him what his position is and what his campaign will be. So I don't want to speak for him in particular, but I think in general, you can make the case that what the Dobbs decision did was put that decision back to the states. And you would respect that as a member of Congress and allow the states to decide what their policies will be and what those policies won't be.
But he's on record as saying that he would not rule out voting in favor of a national ban on abortion in Congress.
So I haven't seen that. I'll have to go back and look at the debates and then look at what he said, and I'll have to obviously talk to him to see what he says. Obviously, there have been pro-life representatives in the 8th congressional district before, whether that was, I believe, Jennifer Dunn was pro-choice, but I think Dave Reichert campaigned as being pro-life. Obviously, it's a different environment now than maybe 6 years ago. But so that's ultimately going to be up to the candidate to define what their position will be, what their position won't be.
Let's end with this, Caleb. One thing that you think Republicans need to do different between now and November.
Well, I think that the biggest thing, we've got to make sure we're connecting with our voters and listening to voters. I think we've been doing that in the primary, and I think we'll continue to do that. But it's really, I think we as the party and any of our candidates, you can't take anything for granted. And I think, unfortunately, with the idea of a red wave, with the idea of momentum, it's easy to think this sort of thing is just going to happen. History, it may be a precedent, but it's not a guarantee of what's going to happen in the future. So even though this is a midterm election, even though President Biden is deeply unpopular in Washington state, and frankly, even though a lot of our constituents, a lot of voters are struggling with the Biden economy, struggling with 9.1% inflation, struggling with expensive gas prices, struggling to afford rent and groceries and everything else, we've got to connect with voters, we've got to listen to voters, and we've got to make the case that we care about them and we will act on that concern. I think there is Washington state definitely leans blue. And so there's a perception of what the Republican Party is, what the Republican Party stands for. And we have to make the case that maybe in some cases and our candidates are different than what maybe they think or what maybe they've heard. So it's all comes back to, you got to show up, you got to listen, and you got to make the pitch on what you're going to do to better the lives of the people you're seeking to represent.
Yep, effective, honest messaging. And I hope you can also reach out to those voters. And I've heard from them who say they don't vote because they don't think their ballot will count. I just don't think that that's going to be productive. And so I don't know how big of a segment of the Republican voting base that is, but I don't know that you guys can afford to have any voters sitting out in November. So Caleb Heimlich, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Brandi.